The marble floors of the Manhattan Supreme Court didn't just echo with footsteps that morning. They echoed with the sound of a dynasty crumbling. When billionaire software mogul Alton Price walked in, he was holding the hand of his 23-year-old mistress, wearing a smile that said he owned the building. He thought he was there to sign a check and trade his wife of 30 years for a younger model. He thought the law was just another employee he could fire, but he didn't see the woman sitting in the back of the courtroom, silent as a grave. He didn't know that in less than an hour, Judge Holloway would say 5 words that would strip him of everything he had ever built. This isn't just a divorce case. This is the story of the most brutal corporate ambush in New York history. It was raining in Lower Manhattan, a cold grey drizzle that slicked the pavement of Center Street, but the weather did nothing to dampen the circus assembled outside the New York Supreme Court. They were there for the divorce of the century, as the Post had dubbed it. On one side of the docket was Alton Price, the CEO of Price Vraxos, a logistics and AI conglomerate worth an estimated $40 billion. On the other side was Elizabeth Price, the woman who had stood silently in his shadow since before he made his first million. At 8:55 a.m., a caravan of 3 black Cadillac Escalades pulled up to the curb. The press surged forward, cameras flashing like a strobe light storm. The doors of the middle vehicle opened, and out stepped Alton. He was 62 but looked 50, thanks to aggressive personal training and subtle cosmetic work. He wore a navy bespoke suit cut by his preferred tailor on Savile Row, and his silver hair was swept back with careless precision. He didn't step out alone. First, a long leg encased in a sheer stocking emerged, followed by the click of a red-soled Louboutin heel. Then came Sienna Banks. She was 24, a former hostess at a club in Miami, where Alton had closed a merger deal 2 years prior. She wore a cream-colored trench coat, belted tightly at the waist, and oversized sunglasses, despite the overcast sky. Alton gripped Sienna's hand tightly, interlocking their fingers. It was a deliberate, brutal display of power. Usually in high-stakes divorces, the mistress is hidden away in a hotel in the Hamptons until the ink is dry. Bringing her to the initial hearing was an act of war. It was Alton telling the world, and specifically his wife, that he did not care about optics, because he held all the cards. "Mr. Price, is it true you're offering $1 billion settlement?" a reporter shouted. Alton just smirked, guiding Sienna up the stairs. "No comment or cut," he said, though his expression screamed that $1 billion was pocket change he was happy to pay to be rid of his past. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy-smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. The gallery was packed. Junior associates from rival law firms, legal bloggers, and curious onlookers filled every bench. Elizabeth Price was already there. She sat at the defendant's table, her back, straight hands, folded on top of a plain manila folder. In stark contrast to Sienna's Hollywood glamour, Elizabeth wore a charcoal wool suit that looked at least 5 years old. Her hair, a mix of grey and brown, was pulled back in a severe bun. She wore no makeup. To the casual observer, she looked like a tired schoolteacher or a librarian who had wandered into the wrong room. She did not turn around when the doors banged open. She did not flinch when the whispers started a wave of, "That's her," and "Look at the girlfriend." Alton strode down the center aisle, Sienna trailing him like a trophy. He stopped at the plaintiff's table and leaned over to his lead counsel, Preston Gould. Gould was a man known in New York legal circles as the Butcher. He charged $2,000 an hour and had never lost a high-profile divorce case. "Is she ready to surrender?" Alton whispered to Gould, loud enough for the first few rows to hear. Gould chuckled, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "She doesn't have a choice, Alton. The prenup is ironclad. We'll be out of here by lunch." Alton finally looked at his wife. He expected to see tears or perhaps the trembling rage he had seen at the dinner table the night he told her he was leaving. Instead, Elizabeth sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead at the empty judge's bench. Next to Elizabeth sat her lawyer, a man named Simon Keller. Unlike the polished, shark-like Gould, Keller looked like he had slept in his suit. He was a solo practitioner from Queens who mostly handled estate planning and small business disputes. When Alton had seen the notice of representation, he had laughed until he choked on his scotch. Elizabeth had hired a strip mall lawyer to fight a battalion of Ivy League litigators. "It's almost sad," Sienna whispered, taking her seat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind Alton. "She looks defeated." "She was defeated the day she married me," Alton murmured back, winking at her. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur. "All rise, the Honourable Judge Beatrice Halloway presiding." Judge Halloway swept into the room. She was a woman in her late 60s, with eyes that could cut glass. She was known for her impatience with theatrics and her encyclopedic knowledge of contract law. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and looked down at the two tables. "Good morning," Halloway said, her voice dry. "We are here for the matter of Price versus Price, division of assets and dissolution of marriage. Ready for the plaintiff?" "Your Honor," Gould boomed, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "Ready for the defendant, Your Honor," Keller said softly, half rising from his chair. Judge Halloway looked at the papers in front of her. "I have reviewed the preliminary motions. Mr. Gould, you are moving for a summary judgment based on a prenuptial agreement signed 32 years ago." "We are, Your Honor," Gould said, striding toward the bench. "The document is clear. In the event of a divorce, Mrs. Price is entitled to a fixed sum of $2 million adjusted for inflation and the marital home in Connecticut. All corporate assets, specifically shares in Price Vraxos and its subsidiaries, remain the sole property of Mr. Price." Gould paused for effect, turning to smile at the gallery. "Mr. Price built this empire from a garage startup. Mrs. Price has not been involved in the business operations in any capacity. This is a cut-and-dry case. We are merely asking the court to enforce the contract." Alton leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs. He caught Sienna's eye and gave a small nod. It was going exactly as scripted. Judge Halloway turned her gaze to the defense table. "Mr. Keller, do you contest the validity of the prenuptial agreement?" The room went silent. This was the moment Elizabeth was supposed to beg. This was the moment they would argue duress or mental incompetence or ask for lifestyle maintenance. Simon Keller stood up slowly. He picked up a single piece of paper from his messy table. "No, Your Honor," Keller said, his voice raspy. "We do not contest the prenup. In fact, we agree entirely with Mr. Gould. The prenup is perfectly valid." A ripple of confusion went through the room. Alton frowned. If they weren't fighting the prenup, why were they here? Was she really just going to take the $2 million and leave? It seemed too easy. However, Keller continued, looking over his spectacles at Alton. "The prenup applies to the division of Mr. Price's assets. Our contention today is not about how to divide Mr. Price's money." Keller paused, and for the first time, Elizabeth turned her head. She looked directly at Alton. Her eyes were devoid of love, devoid of hate. They were just cold. "Our contention," Keller said, "is that Mr. Price does not actually own the assets he is attempting to keep." Alton let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "What is he talking about?" he hissed to Gould. Gould waved a hand, dismissing the concern. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. Mr. Price is the founder and CEO of Price Vraxos. His name is on the building. His name is on the SEC filings. This is a desperate stall tactic." "Is it Judge Holloway asked. She looked at Keller. "Explain yourself, counselor." Keller walked to the center of the room. He didn't have the swagger of Gould, but he had a strange, dangerous gravity. "Your Honor, 32 years ago, when the Prices were married, Alton Price was indeed a mechanic working out of a garage. He had an idea for a logistics software. But he had no credit. He had a bankruptcy on his record from a failed venture in his early 20s. No bank would touch him." Keller walked back to the defense table and placed a hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. Mrs. Price, however, was a junior actuary at an insurance firm. She had excellent credit, and she had an inheritance of $50,000 from her grandmother. "Ancient history," Gould interrupted. "Relevant how? Relevant." Keller snapped his voice, suddenly sharp, because of how the company was incorporated. Keller pulled a document from his folder and handed it to the bailiff to pass to the judge. "Mr. Price was paranoid about being sued," Keller explained to the room. He was terrified that his previous creditors would come after his new idea. So he didn't incorporate the business in his name. He asked his wife to do it. Alton stiffened. He remembered that. It was a lifetime ago. They were eating instant noodles on the floor of their apartment. He had told Liz that he needed to keep his name off the paperwork, just for a few months, just until the heat died down from his old debts. She had signed everything without reading it, trusting him completely. "That was a shell company," Alton whispered to Gould. "I transferred everything out of that years ago." Gould nodded. "Your Honor, the entity formed in 1992, Blue Sky Logistics, was dissolved decades ago. The current assets are held by Price Vraxos, a Delaware corporation, formed in 1998, of which Alton is the sole majority shareholder." "Correct," Keller said. "Mr. Price is the majority shareholder of Price Vraxos." Keller smiled a thin, wintry smile. "But who owns the intellectual property?" The silence that fell over the courtroom was heavy. "You see," Keller continued, pacing slowly, "when Price Vraxos was formed in 1998, it was created as an operating company. It was designed to license the software code that Alton had written. But the code itself, the source code, the patent rights, the very DNA of the $40 billion empire was never transferred to the new company." Alton's face went pale. He felt a bead of sweat roll down his spine. "The intellectual property," Keller said, his voice dropping to a hush, "remained the property of the original entity, Blue Sky Logistics, to protect it from corporate liability. That was Mr. Gould's own advice to Mr. Price at the time, was it not? Keep the IP separate. So if the company goes under, you keep the tech." Gould froze. He stopped scribbling on his notepad. He remembered the strategy. It was a standard asset protection move. And, Keller said, turning to look at Elizabeth, since Blue Sky Logistics was never dissolved, merely left dormant, and since Elizabeth Price is the sole director, sole officer, and sole shareholder of Blue Sky Logistics. Keller picked up a piece of paper and held it up. It was a licensing agreement dated 1998. This agreement states that Price Vraxos has the right to use the software at the pleasure of the IP holder. It is a revocable license, revocable with 30 days' notice. The gallery began to murmur. Reporters were frantically typing on their phones. "This morning," Keller said, "at 8 a.m., Mrs. Price filed a notice of revocation. As of 30 days from now, Price Vraxos will no longer have the legal right to use the software that runs its logistics, its AI, or its database." Alton stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "That's a lie. I wrote that code. It's mine." "Sit down, Mr. Price," Judge Holloway barked. "He's lying. Alton shouted, his composure shattering. He pointed a trembling finger at Elizabeth. "She doesn't know anything about code. She's a housewife. She made sandwiches while I worked 18-hour days." Elizabeth slowly raised her eyes. She didn't shout. She didn't stand up. She just leaned into the microphone on the table. "I didn't just make sandwiches, Alton," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried to every corner of the room. "I handled the filings. I paid the renewal fees every year from my personal checking account because you were too busy buying yachts to remember the administrative upkeep. You forgot about Blue Sky because it wasn't glamorous. You forgot about it because you thought you were untouchable." She paused, and her gaze shifted to Sienna, who looked terrified in the front row. "You built the walls of the castle, Alton," Elizabeth said. "But I own the ground it stands on." Gould was frantically flipping through his files, his face a mask of panic. He was looking for a transfer document, a deed, anything that moved the IP from the wife's shell company to the husband's corporation. He wasn't finding it. "Your Honor," Gould stammered. "We request a recess. We need to verify these claims." "Request granted," Judge Holloway said, banging her gavel. "We reconvene in 1 hour. And Mr. Gould, you better have a hell of a rebuttal, or your client is going to walk out of here, owning a very expensive company that isn't allowed to do business." As the judge exited the room, erupted, reporters surged toward the railing. Alton turned to Gould, grabbing him by the lapels of his expensive suit. "Fix this, Preston. Tell me she's bluffing." I need to check the archives," Gould said, pulling away sweat visible on his forehead. Alton looked back at the defense table. Elizabeth was calmly packing her folder. She stood up, smoothed her skirt, and looked at Alton one last time. "You brought her," Elizabeth said, nodding toward Sienna. "I hope she has money, because you're going to need it." The antechamber of the Supreme Court was a sterile box of glass and polished wood, designed for quiet settlements. But currently it was hosting a meltdown. Elton Price was pacing the length of the room, his face a mottled red that clashed with his silk tie. He looked like a trapped animal. Every few seconds he would turn to Preston Gould, who was frantically making phone calls in the corner. "How did you miss this?" Alton roared, kicking a heavy oak chair. "I pay you $3 million a year to cover my blind spots, and you tell me my wife, my housewife, owns my company." "It's an anomaly, Alton," Gould snapped, covering the mouthpiece of his phone. "It was a shell company from 30 years ago. It should have been dissolved. The auditors missed it because the licensing fees were so small. They were categorized as office expenses. She was charging us pennies, Alton. Pennies it fell under the radar. She was playing the long game," Alton muttered, running a hand through his hair, ruining the perfect coiffure. "For 30 years. She waited. Sitting in the corner, Sienna Banks was scrolling through her iPhone. Her face was pale. She wasn't looking at Instagram. She was looking at the stock market. "Alton," Sienna said, her voice trembling slightly. "CNBC just broke the story. Price-Vraxos intellectual property dispute. The stock is down 12% in 20 minutes. That's $4 billion in market cap gone." Alton spun around to face her. "Put the phone away, Sienna. It's a blip. We'll fix it." "It doesn't look like a blip," she said, her eyes narrowing. She looked at Alton, really looked at him for the first time that day. Without the aura of invincibility, without the checkbook that could silence any problem, he looked old. He looked tired. And suddenly the age gap didn't feel like a power move. It felt like a burden. The door opened. The room went silent as Elizabeth Price walked in, followed closely by her rumpled lawyer, Simon Keller. Elizabeth didn't sit. She stood at the head of the table looking down at Alton. Alton straightened his jacket, trying to summon the CEO persona that had terrified boardrooms for decades. "Elizabeth," he said, forcing a calm tone. "This little stunt is impressive. I'll give you that. You've embarrassed me. Congratulations." "I haven't even started, Alton," Elizabeth said quietly. "Let's cut the theatrics." Alton waved a hand. "You want more money? Fine. The prenup gives you $2 million. I'll tear it up. I'll give you $20 million. Cash. Tax-free. You sign the IP transfer, you walk away, and you go live in, I don't know, Tuscany. Whatever it is you women do." Simon Keller cleared his throat. "Mr. Price, my client is not interested in a cash settlement. $50 million. Alton barked. "That's generational wealth, Liz. Don't be stupid. Think about the kids." "The kids are grown, Alton," Elizabeth said, "and they hate you. You missed David's graduation for a golf trip. You missed Sarah's wedding because you were closing a deal with Sienna here." Sienna flinched. $75 million, Alton said, sweat beading on his upper lip. "And the house in Aspen. That's my final offer. You walk out of here with more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. Elizabeth stepped closer. She placed her hands on the table and leaned in. The scent of her perfume, a simple lavender scent she had worn since college, hit Alton. It smelled like the days when they were happy. It smelled like betrayal. "You don't get it," Elizabeth whispered. "I don't want your money. I have plenty. I've been investing the licensing fees for 20 years. I have my own portfolio, Alton. I'm worth 8 figures on my own." Alton's jaw dropped. "You... What?" "I want the company," Elizabeth said. Alton laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "You can't run a tech giant, Liz. You don't know the first thing about AI logistics." "No," she agreed, "but I know who does." She slid a glossy brochure across the table. Alton looked down. It was a prospectus for Vanguard Systems. His blood ran cold. Vanguard was his sworn enemy. It was run by Leonard Vole, a man Alton had sued 3 times. Vole had sworn to destroy Alton if it was the last thing he did. "I'm not going to run the company," Elizabeth said, her voice turning to steel. "I'm going to sell the license, exclusively, to Leonard Vole. He's offering a very generous royalty package, and he plans to rebrand the software. He's going to erase the name, Price, from the code forever." "You can't," Alton wheezed. "That's my legacy. That's my life's work." "No, Alton," Elizabeth said, glancing at Sienna. "That was your life's work. This," she gestured to the Mistress, "is your midlife crisis. And now you're going to pay for it." Sienna stood up abruptly. The realization had fully landed. If Alton lost the company, he wasn't a billionaire. He was a 62-year-old man with massive alimony payments, a destroyed reputation, and no income. "I need to go to the bathroom," Sienna mumbled, clutching her Birkin bag tight. "Sit down, Sienna," Alton snapped. "I said I need to go." She shouted, her voice shrill. She pushed past Elizabeth and ran out the door. She didn't head for the bathroom. She headed for the elevator. Elizabeth watched her go with a faint, pitying smile. "She's not coming back, Alton." She checked the stock price, too. Alton slumped into the chair, head in his hands. Gould looked at him, then at Elizabeth. The lawyer knew when a ship was sinking. "Mrs. Price." Gould said, his voice respectful for the first time. "Surely there is a middle ground. Destruction of the company hurts the shareholders. It hurts the employees." "Then you better find a legal loophole fast, Mr. Gould," Elizabeth said, turning to leave, "because we go back in front of Judge Holloway in 10 minutes, and I'm ready to twist the knife." The courtroom was louder than before. The news had spread. The gallery was standing room only. Cameras were pressed against the glass of the back doors, trying to get a shot of the man who was losing everything. When Alton walked back in, he looked like a ghost. He sat down heavily. Sienna's seat in the front row was empty. The visual was striking. The king had lost his queen, and his consort had fled. He was alone. "All rise," the bailiff called. Judge Holloway returned. She looked energized. Cases like this were rare. Usually they were boring arithmetic. This was Greek tragedy. "Mr. Gould," Judge Holloway said, looking over her glasses. "You requested this recess to find documentation proving that Blue Sky Logistics was effectively transferred to Mr. Price, or that a constructive trust exists. What do you have for me?" Gould stood up. He had regained some of his composure. He was a fighter, and he had found a desperate angle. "Your Honor." Gould began buttoning his jacket. "We concede that no formal transfer of the IP occurred. However, we argue the doctrine of constructive trust and marital commingling." He walked to the center of the floor, pointing a finger at Elizabeth. "Mrs. Price claims this company is hers, but for 30 years the maintenance of this IP, the electricity to run the servers, the internet bills, the very roof over the head of the Home Office was paid for by marital funds. The money used to keep Blue Sky alive came from Mr. Price's earnings. Therefore the asset has been commingled. It is no longer separate property. It is marital property, subject to the prenup." Elton looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. If it was marital property, the prenup applied. The prenup gave her $2 million and nothing else. If Gould won this point, Alton kept the company. "Excellent argument," Judge Holloway mused. She turned to Simon Keller. "Mr. Keller, if marital funds sustained the asset becomes marital." Simon Keller stood up. He didn't look worried. He looked like a man holding a royal flush. "A valid point, Your Honor," Keller said. "If, indeed, marital funds were used." Keller pulled a thick binder from his bag. It landed on the table with a heavy thud. "These are the bank records for Blue Sky Logistics from 1992 to present," Keller said. "Every year the filing fees, the server costs, and the administrative expenses were paid from a specific account. Account ending in 4590 at Chase Manhattan." Keller opened the binder to the first page. "And where did the money in account 4590 come from?" Keller asked rhetorically. "Alton's paycheck," Gould shouted. "No," Keller said softly. "As we mentioned earlier, Mrs. Price received an inheritance of $50,000 from her grandmother, Margaret Stone, in 1991. Keller held up a yellowed check copy. "Inheritance," Keller addressed the judge, "is universally considered separate property in the state of New York, provided it is never commingled with joint accounts. Mrs. Price deposited that inheritance into a separate account. She never added Alton's name. She never deposited a single penny of Alton's salary into it." Alton froze. He remembered Liz asking him for money for the business fees once years ago. He had told her, "Don't bother me with that clutter. Pay it out of your PIN money." "The records show," Keller continued, "that every single cent spent on Blue Sky Logistics came from the inheritance account. The asset was born from separate property. It was sustained by separate property. And therefore—" Keller turned to Elton, his eyes hard. "The fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine does not apply here. But the fruit of the separate tree remains separate. Blue Sky Logistics is 100% Elizabeth Price's sole property. The prenup does not touch it." Judge Holloway nodded slowly. She looked at Gould. "Do you have evidence that contradicts these bank statements, Mr. Gould? Did Mr. Price ever contribute to this specific account?" Gould looked at Alton. Alton shook his head weakly. He hadn't. He had been too arrogant. He had wanted nothing to do with the administrative side of things. "No, Your Honor," Gould whispered. "Then the ruling stands," Judge Holloway said. "The intellectual property belongs to the defendant." "But, Your Honor—" Alton stood up, ignoring Gould's restraining hand. "She can't just shut me down. We employ 10,000 people. This is blackmail." "It is not blackmail, Mr. Price," Judge Holloway said icily. "It is capitalism. You signed a contract 30 years ago to protect yourself from creditors. You hid your assets behind your wife's name. You used her as a shield. Do not complain now that she has decided to be a sword." "However," the judge continued, looking at Elizabeth, "Mrs. Price, while you own the IP, shutting down a public company overnight causes irreparable harm to third parties, shareholders, and employees. I am inclined to grant an emergency injunction, keeping the license active for a brief period, to allow for negotiation." Elizabeth stood up. "We understand, Your Honor. We are willing to grant a temporary extension of the license." Alton exhaled. "Okay. A reprieve. He could work with this. He could raise money. He could fight." "For a fee," Elizabeth added. "What kind of fee?" Judge Holloway asked. Elizabeth looked directly at Alton. "Since the previous agreement was a token sum, we need to adjust to market rates. The market rate for the proprietary AI code that runs a $40 billion company is significant." Keller handed a paper to the judge. "We are asking for a monthly licensing fee of $100 million, payable weekly." And, Alton choked out. "And," Elizabeth said, her voice ringing clear in the silence, "we require a seat on the board. Not just a seat. We want the chairperson's seat." "You want me to fire myself?" Alton asked, incredulous. "No." Elizabeth smiled. "I want to be your boss, Alton. I want to sit at the head of the table and watch you work for me. I want to approve your expenses. I want to review your travel. I want to ensure you aren't spending company money on non-essential personnel." The courtroom erupted in whispers. It was the ultimate humiliation. She didn't want to destroy the company. She wanted to enslave him within it. Judge Holloway suppressed a smile. "Mr. Gould, you have until 9 a.m. tomorrow to accept the licensing terms or face a total shutdown. Court is adjourned." The gavel banged. Alton collapsed back into his chair. He looked around for Sienna again, forgetting she was gone. He looked at Gould, who was packing his briefcase with the urgency of a man fleeing a crime scene. Then he looked at Elizabeth. She was buttoning her cheap coat. She looked younger than she had that morning. The weight was gone. She walked past his table on her way out. She stopped, leaning down so only he could hear. "Don't be late for work tomorrow, Alton," she whispered. "We have a board meeting at 8 o'clock." The walk from the courtroom doors to the waiting escalade was usually a distance Alton Price covered in 30 seconds of confident strides. Today, it felt like the Bataan Death March. As he pushed through the heavy oak doors of the Supreme Court, the wall of sound hit him physically. It wasn't just camera shutters anymore. It was a roar. The crowd had tripled in size during the hearing. Word had leaked. The New York Post had already pushed a notification to 3 million of phones. "Wife owns the Empire Price, humiliated in court." Alton kept his head down, flanked by his security detail. Preston Gould was nowhere to be seen, having slipped out a side exit to avoid the questions he couldn't answer. Alton was alone in the spotlight. "Mr. Price, is it true you're being evicted from your own board? Alton, where is Sienna? Did she dump you in the lobby? Hey, Alton, my wife wants to know if you're hiring." The jeers were new. Alton was used to envy, used to hatred, but he was not used to mockery. He was the titan of industry. He was the man who automated the global supply chain. He wasn't a punchline. He reached the car door, and a reporter from TMZ shoved a phone screen in his face. "Alton, have you seen this? It has 5 million views in 20 minutes. Alton glanced at the screen against his will. It was a shaky video taken inside the courthouse hallway. It showed Sienna Banks, her coat flapping open, sprinting toward the elevator. The caption read, #Rat fleeing the ship. The comments scrolling by were brutal. She moved faster than his stock price dropped. "Secure the bag now." She secured the Uber. Alton slapped the phone away and dove into the back seat of his SUV. "Drive," he screamed at the driver. "Just drive." The car lurched forward, forcing photographers to jump out of the way. Alton pulled out his phone. His notifications were a solid block of white text. Board members, investors, his PR crisis team, his cardiologist. He opened his trading app. Price Vraxos PVX was in freefall. The line on the graph looked like a cliff, down 18%. $6 billion of value vaporized in an hour. "Sir, where are we going?" the driver asked, eyeing Alton in the rearview mirror with a look that bordered on pity. "The office," Alton said instinctively. Then he stopped. If he went to the office, he'd have to face them. The VPs who had fawned over him yesterday, the secretaries he had ignored. They would all know. They would know he was a tenant in his own building. "No," Alton rasped. "Take me to the Pierre Hotel and call security. Tell them no one comes up to the penthouse. No one." Meanwhile, 3 miles away, Elizabeth Price was sitting in a booth at a diner on 3rd Avenue. It was a place with laminated menus and sticky syrup bottles on the tables, the kind of place Alton hadn't stepped foot in since 1995. Simon Keller sat across from her, devouring a celebratory cheeseburger. "You're trending," Simon said, wiping ketchup from his chin. He turned his iPad around. Twitter X was ablaze. A photo of Elizabeth walking out of the courtroom, head-high grey bun, tight, wearing her 5-year-old coat, was side by side with a photo of Alton, looking sweaty and terrified. The caption on the viral tweet was simple, "Strategy beats swagger." "They're calling you the Queen of the Long Con," Simon chuckled. "I've had calls from Good Morning America, 60 Minutes, and Oprah's producers. They want the exclusive." Elizabeth sipped her black coffee. She didn't look triumphant. She looked focused. "Ignore them," she said. "I don't want fame, Simon. Fame is a distraction. Liz, you just took down the biggest ego in Manhattan. You're going to be famous whether you like it or not." "I haven't taken him down yet," she said, putting her cup down with a sharp clink. "Alton is a cornered animal. He's arrogant, but he's not stupid. He built that company from nothing. He knows the code better than anyone, even if he hasn't written a line in years. He's going to try something tonight." Simon stopped chewing. "The injunction is clear. If he touches the IP, he goes to jail." "Alton doesn't believe in jail," Elizabeth said, looking out the window at the rain. "He believes laws are suggestions for poor people. He's going to try to bypass the blue sky dependencies. He's going to try to patch the software so he doesn't need my license." "That's impossible," Simon said. "The entire architecture runs on your kernel. It would take months to rewrite." "Or one very long night with the right team," Elizabeth countered. She reached into her purse and pulled out a burner phone. "Which is why I need you to make a call." "Who are we calling?" "There's a man named Victor Kovich," Elizabeth said. "He's the chief technology officer at Price Vraxos. He's loyal to Alton. He worships him. Alton is going to call him within the hour to start the rewrite." "Okay," Simon said slowly. "So why are we calling him?" Elizabeth smiled, and for the first time it was a dangerous smile. "Because Victor has a secret. and I've been sitting on it for 10 years waiting for a rainy day. The penthouse of the Pierre Hotel was dark, lit only by the glow of huge monitors that had been hastily set up on the Louis XIV dining table. The air was thick with the hum of portable server racks and the smell of stale cigarette smoke. Alton Price had discarded his suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie undone. He paced the room like a caged tiger. Sitting at the table were 4 men. They were the Black Team, the elite coders of Price Vraxos, the ones who handled government contracts and hostile takeovers. In the center of them was Viktor Kovic, the CTO. Viktor was a giant of a man, brilliant and utterly unscrupulous. "Talk to me, Viktor," Alton barked. "Can we do it?" Viktor didn't look up from his screen. His fingers were flying across the mechanical keyboard. "It is complex, Alton. The Blue Sky protocol isn't just an add-on. It is the spine. The logistics algorithm calls home to the Blue Sky server every 0.4 seconds to verify the optimization paths. If we cut the connection, the trucks stop moving, the ships lose their routing, the warehouse robots freeze. I don't care about the logistics," Alton shouted. "I care about the legal ownership. We need to create a mirror kernel, something that looks like Blue Sky, but resides on our servers. We deploy the patch tonight. When she walks into the board meeting tomorrow, I want to tell her that her license is worthless because we don't use her software anymore. That is a rewrite of 4 million lines of code," one of the junior engineers muttered nervously. "You don't need to rewrite it all," Alton snapped. "Just the handshake protocols. Spoof the authentication. Make the system think it's talking to Blue Sky, but redirect it to an internal dummy driver." Viktor stopped typing. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "A bypass," he murmured. "It's risky. If the system detects the spoof, it could trigger a catastrophic fail-safe. The data corruption could be total." "Take the risk," Alton ordered. "I built this machine. I know what it can take. Do it." Viktor hesitated. He looked at Alton. He had worked for this man for 15 years. He had seen Alton destroy competitors, bribe officials, and crush unions. He respected the ruthlessness, but this was different. This was suicide. "Alton," Viktor said quietly, "if we do this and it fails, the stock goes to 0. Not 12% down. 0. Bankruptcy. It's 0 anyway, if that woman takes the chair." Alton slammed his fist on the table. "Do you understand? She wants to sell us to Leonard Vole. Vole will fire you, Viktor. He'll scrap your department. This is survival. Now code." Viktor sighed. He put his glasses back on. "Initiating the bypass sequence. We need root access to the central mainframe." "Authorized," Alton said, typing his master key password into the console. The screens flashed red, then green. Lines of code cascaded down the monitors like a digital waterfall. The room fell silent, save for the frantic clicking of keys. 10% complete. 30% complete. Alton poured himself a scotch, his hand trembling slightly. He was going to win. He always won. He would walk into that boardroom tomorrow, look Elizabeth in the eye, and tell her that her company was nothing but an empty shell. He would pay the fine for breaching the injunction later. Better to ask forgiveness than permission. "Alton," Viktor said, his voice tight. "What has it done?" "No," Viktor said. "We hit a wall." "What wall?" "There are no firewalls I don't have the keys to." "It's not a firewall," Viktor said, turning his monitor so Alton could see. "It's a message." Alton squinted at the screen. In the middle of the complex code stream, a dialogue box had popped up. It wasn't a system error. It was a chat window. "User admin Liz has entered the chat." Alton's blood froze. "She's in the system." "How is she in the system?" "I revoked her access years ago." "She's not in our system." Victor said, his face pale. She's monitoring the handshake. She sees us trying to bypass. Text appeared in the box, character by character, as if someone were typing it calmly from a diner 3 miles away. Admin_Liz. Hello, Alton. I see you're trying to hotwire the car. Alton grabbed the keyboard, shoving Victor aside. He typed furiously. Admin_Alton. Get out of my network. Liz. This is corporate espionage. Admin_Liz. Actually, since you are attempting to modify the code, I own. This is copyright infringement. And Alton, check the timestamps. Alton looked at the corner of the screen. Admin_Liz. I didn't just lock the door. I changed the locks 10 minutes ago. What did she do? Alton screamed at Victor. Victor was checking the logs. He looked sick. She updated the encryption key on the blue sky side. The servers just lost sync. A siren began to wail on one of the laptops. System failure, the junior engineer yelled. The Asian markets just opened. The logistics grid in Tokyo is down. The trucks aren't moving. The system can't verify the route because it can't talk to blue sky. Admin_Liz. You have 2 choices, Alton. Choice A. You keep trying to hack your own company, cause a global logistics meltdown, and go to prison for criminal negligence. Alton stared at the blinking cursor. Admin_Liz choice B. You shut down this Project Lazarus, go to sleep and bring me my coffee at 8 a.m. Black. 2 sugars. Alton stared at the screen. The siren was getting louder. Tokyo was offline. London was next. If the grid went down globally, Price Vraxos would be liable for billions in damages within hours. Alton, Victor shouted. We have to abort. We have to restore the connection to her server. We need her key. Alton stood there, his chest heaving. The Scotch glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The sound was deafening in the tense room. He looked at the chat window. Admin_Liz tick-tock Alton. He had lost. He wasn't just beaten. He was checkmated. Abort, Alton whispered. What? Victor asked. I said abort. Alton screamed, his voice cracking. Restore the connection. Revert to the original protocols. Give her whatever she wants. Victor hammered the keys. Rolling back. Rolling back. Connection restored. Tokyo is coming back online. Crisis averted. The room exhaled. The engineers slumped in their chairs. Alton fell back onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. The chat window blinked one last time. Admin_Liz. See you in the morning, Chairman. Alton closed his eyes. The fight was over. The humiliation was just beginning. The boardroom on the 50th floor of the Price Vraxos Tower was a masterpiece of intimidation. The walls were glass, offering a panoramic view of the city Alton Price had conquered. The table was a single slab of black walnut, 30 feet long. Usually Alton sat at the head, the city framed behind him like a halo. Today the chair at the head of the table was empty. At 7:55 a.m., the board members began to file in. They were a collection of the wealthiest power players in New York hedge fund managers, retired senators, and tech investors. They smelled blood. The stock was still down, but it had stabilized after the glitch the night before. They knew something had happened, but they didn't know the full extent of the war that had been fought in the dark. Alton entered at 7:58 a.m. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week, let alone one night. His suit was fresh, but his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands had a subtle tremor he couldn't hide. He walked to the sideboard, poured a cup of black coffee, and added 2 sugars. He stared at the cup. It was the most humiliating task of his life. At 8 o'clock, a.m. sharp, the double doors opened. Elizabeth Price walked in. She wasn't wearing the old wool suit today. She was wearing a tailored white blazer that looked like armor. Simon Keller walked a step behind her, carrying the heavy binder. The board members stood up, an automatic reflex they usually reserved only for Alton. Elizabeth walked to the head of the table. She didn't sit immediately. She looked at Alton, who was standing by the coffee pot. "Good morning, Alton," she said, her voice pleasant but devoid of warmth. Alton walked over to her. The room was so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. He placed the coffee cup on the coaster in front of her. "Black." "2 sugars," Alton croaked. "Thank you," she said. She took a sip, then sat down. "Please everyone take your seats." Alton stood awkwardly. His usual chair was occupied. There were no other empty chairs at the main table. "Pull up a side chair." "Alton," Elizabeth said, gesturing to the seating usually reserved for junior aides. Alton's face flushed a deep crimson, but he did as he was told. He dragged a metal chair to the side of the table, sitting lower than everyone else. "We have a full agenda," Elizabeth began, addressing the board. "As you know, I am the owner of the intellectual property that powers this company. As of yesterday, I have also assumed the role of executive chairwoman." "Objection," said Marcus Dean, a board member, and Alton's old college friend. "Alton is the founder. He owns the majority of the voting shares of the corporation. You control the IP, Liz, and we respect that leverage, but you can't just usurp the CEO role without a shareholder vote." "I was getting to that," Elizabeth said coolly. "Alton does own the shares, but shares in a technology company are based on the premise that the founder is the visionary behind the technology. If that premise is proven false, if the founder is proven to be a fraud, there are clauses in the corporate charter that strip him of his voting rights. The moral turpitude and fraud clause." Alton shot up from his low chair. "Fraud, I built this. I wrote the code in 1992. I am the visionary." "Are you?" Elizabeth asked. She signaled to Simon Keller. Simon opened the binder and connected his laptop to the massive screen on the wall. A scanned image appeared. It was a page from a spiral-bound notebook, dated November 1991. It was a handwritten algorithm. The handwriting was looped feminine and meticulous. "This," Elizabeth said, "is the original kernel for the Blue Sky logistic sorting algorithm. Note the date, November 1991. She clicked a button. Another image appeared. A deposition transcript from 1999 where Alton swore under oath that he came up with the idea in a flash of genius in a garage in 1992. "Alton didn't write the code," Elizabeth told the stunned room. "I did." The silence was deafening. Alton stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing. "I was the actuary," Elizabeth continued, her voice gaining strength. "I was the one who understood the math of risk and routing. Alton was a mechanic. He was charming. He was a good salesman. But he couldn't code a Hello World program if his life depended on it." She looked at the board members. "We made a deal when we were young. I was shy. I didn't want the attention. I wanted to solve the puzzles. Alton wanted the fame. So I wrote the code, and he sold it. I let him put his name on the patents because I trusted him. I thought we were a team." She turned to Alton. The look in her eyes was one of profound disappointment. "But you started to believe your own lie, Alton. You thought you were a genius. You forgot who was actually doing the work in the background, fixing your messes, patching the updates while you were out at gala dinners." "She's lying," Alton screamed, desperate now. "It's a forgery. Where is the proof? It's her word against mine." "I thought you might say that," Elizabeth said. "So I invited a guest." The side door opened. Viktor Kovic, the CTO, walked in. He looked even worse than Alton. He refused to meet Alton's eyes. "Victor," Alton whispered, "Mr. Kovich," Elizabeth said, "please tell the board what you found in the source code last night when you tried to run the bypass." Victor cleared his throat. He looked at his hands. "Every line of code in the core kernel. It has a signature. Hidden in the comments. Encrypted in a way we never noticed because we never looked deep enough." "And what is that signature?" Elizabeth asked. "It's not a name," Victor said softly. "It's a dedication." Victor looked up at the screen. He typed a command on the keyboard. The code on the screen scrolled rapidly and stopped at the very bottom of the foundational block. There, hidden in the binary, was a comment line // coded by Elizabeth. "For Alton, my love. 1992. The time stamp on that comment is original," Victor said to the board. "It hasn't been touched in 30 years. It is the bedrock of the entire system. If Alton wrote it, he wouldn't have dedicated it to himself." The room turned to look at Alton. The evidence was irrefutable. The genius of logistics was a myth. He was just a husband who had taken credit for his wife's brilliance, then discarded her when she became inconvenient. Alton slumped back into his metal chair. The fight went out of him. The lie he had lived for 3 decades had finally collapsed under the weight of the truth. "The fraud clause is triggered," Marcus Dean said quietly. "Alton, you are stripped of your voting rights, effective immediately." "I move for a vote of no confidence," another board member said. "Seconded," said a third. "All in favor of removing Alton Price as CEO and chairman?" Elizabeth asked. Every hand in the room went up, even Marcus Dean. Elizabeth looked at Alton. "You're fired, Alton." Alton stood up slowly. He looked old. He looked small. He looked around the room, but there were no allies left. No mistress. No lawyers. No friends. I have a golden parachute," Alton mumbled, grasping at straws. "The severance package, null and void due to termination. For cause," Elizabeth said, closing her folder. "You leave with nothing, Alton, just your 401k. And I believe the prenup you fought so hard for, it gives you the marital home in Connecticut. I hope you enjoy it. It's very quiet there." Alton turned and walked toward the door. His footsteps were heavy. He didn't look back. The doors closed behind him with a soft click. The room was silent for a moment. Then Elizabeth adjusted the microphone. "Now," she said, looking at the board with clear, sharp eyes. "Let's get to work. I have some ideas for the version 2.0 update that I've been working on for about 15 years. Victor Kovich sat up straighter, looking at her with newfound respect. The board members leaned in. The Queen wasn't just on the throne. She was the one who had built the castle. Alton Price left the building through the service entrance to avoid the press, but they found him anyway. The picture of him hailing a yellow taxi in the rain, soaking wet and alone, became the defining image of the year. Sienna Banks gave a tell-all interview to Vanity Fair, titled "The Billionaire Who Wasn't," which launched her career as a reality TV star. Elizabeth Price didn't sell the company to Leonard Vole. She ran it. Under her leadership, Price Vraxos stock tripled. She became an icon not just for scorned wives, but for every woman who had ever done the work while a man took the credit. She never remarried. She didn't need to. She had her company, her legacy, and the satisfaction of knowing that silence is sometimes the loudest weapon of all. Wow, I don't think anyone saw that final twist coming, that she was the coding genius all along. It just goes to show, you never really know who holds the true power in a relationship until the house of cards comes crashing down. If you enjoyed this story of massive revenge, corporate takedowns, and justice finally being served, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And tell me in the comments, do you think Alton deserved to lose everything? Or was Elizabeth too harsh? I read every comment. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. I'll see you in the next video.